Right, well, one thing that has come up over the years at this conference on a number of occasions is the idea of the Reptilian Agenda. Now, if you're new to this, you're going to have great fun with this. But there is, of course, a theory, and people like David Icke put this out there in a very big way, that, the rulers that, have these shadowy agendas might not be everything that they seem to be. And that belief that they could be reptilian aliens is held as a very sort of strong belief by some people. But to go beyond that and look at, well, what does that mean, right? What is the mythology of this? I think is really going to be a unique way of doing this. And Adam, who is going to speak to us now, he's been trying to make people look at the world through new eyes in a number of ways. Do have a look at his website, looking at tarot, for instance, but in virtual reality. I mean, it's a whole new way of looking at it. And I think that's what we're going to get today, is to take the reptilian agenda and stand back and not even judge it, but say, let's look at this in a way we can really grasp why so many people think this really matters. So I'm really looking forward to this. Give a big hand for Adam Malone. Thank you very much.
Hello. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks, Andy. That was a fantastic introduction, actually. Couldn't have done it better. So welcome to my talk, Transcending the Reptilian Agenda, Reptile Dysfunction in a Story Stranger Than Fiction. My name is Adam Malone, as Andy's kindly introduced me. Currently, I describe myself as an immersive storyteller, but if you ask me in about 5 years, that may be something different. As you can see, I've had a varied sort of professional path, really, mainly in the arts, mainly in storytelling, through visual storytelling, film, media, onto my sort of latest MA, which is an MA in immersive storytelling. And I've got a studio that I'm setting up in Brighton at the moment and creating immersive content. And actually, as you can see, in 2001, for a period there, I was a pest controller, so kind of relevant to this topic. I feel like I'm still doing a bit of pest control, but with the pests of the mind. The main reason that I'm standing here today, apart from the fact that myself and Andy had a meeting over a bottle of wine in East Sussex, is that I did this MA in myth, cosmology and the sacred. So I really began to get a grasp of what is myth. Myth comes from mythos in ancient Greek, which means story. What is cosmology? Cosmology is the narrative in which we describe the world, how we got here, and where we came from. And the sacred. And these are experiences at a time, usually with an other, that involves revelation of some description. But I just want to say that I'm no academic. I was a terrible academic, and it took me about 4 or 5 years to finish that degree. So I'm not an academic. And a really interesting way to sort of grasp what I'm going to talk about is, look where we are. We're standing in the centre of perhaps the centre of a mythic Great Britain. We're in Glastonbury. And you know how it feels when you come to Glastonbury. You know what happens when you come here, why you come here. It's because of the stories. It's because of the landscape. And the landscape and the stories sort of feed into one another. And this is the idea of myth that I want to get across, is that we live in myth, and myth lives in us as well. And as I wrote there, the famous line from William Blake's Jerusalem poem, did Jesus walk this landscape? Was he here? Was Joseph Arimathea here in Glastonbury? It kind of doesn't matter, but the story lives on, and that's what's important to the place and us. So really I want to introduce the reptilian myth, ? Because obviously there's a lot of different ways we can approach this idea, and my particular take is coming at it from this angle. I see it as modern day myth making. I think it's actually really important that we're doing this. And I see David Icke, who's the main proponent of this story, this narrative, as actually a fantastic storyteller. He's a great speaker, but I actually think he's a brilliant storyteller as well. But there's a good, bad, and an ugly side to this particular myth, which I want to pick apart during the talk. And I have this question: where have all our stories gone? We've actually forgotten as a culture the importance of myth. The importance of having a narrative that enables us to transcend our limitations. Ever since the Enlightenment period, we've received the machine metaphor. It's the dominant metaphor of our society, that everything is a machine. The body is a machine. Life is a machine. The earth is a machine. The solar system is a machine. And as a result, we're pretty much meaningless machines in empty space, looking for meaning. That leaves this vacuum where we do actually still require stories. Our brains have needed stories in order to understand how to live for a long time. And this is reflected in our culture today. We have currently a narrative confusion at the moment in our culture. Our culture is currently in crisis. There's a conflict around truth, as Andy's talked about in his book. Do we live in a post-truth world? Is there such a thing as fake news? I mean, if you used to think the news was real, then that's also kind of crazy in itself. But there's this idea around truth at the moment that's playing out, and I believe it plays out in David Icke's hypothesis. And it's a split, really, around how we deal with narratives. And as Jeffrey Krippau says, culturally and psychologically speaking, the world is made of stories and people acting them out. There are many stories in the world. Each culture is a big story, each person a little story. So I'm going to just briefly run through my little story. So I did a degree in 2001 in Canterbury Christchurch University, and the logo of my university in Latin there is "The Truth Shall Set You Free," which is actually the name of a David Icke book. So there's a question of what is truth and what is freedom. Whose truth? Whose freedom? Whose version of it? I became a truth seeker. I was hanging out at Avebury and Stonehenge and festivals, and I think if you can look closely at that one, I've probably got a spliff in my mouth. So I used, plant medicines as well, and that was really my approach into sort of self-initiation and trying to find the truth of what is happening in life and what's our place in life. And I engaged with the New Age quite deeply. I would go to any New Age bookshop in any town. I had a lot of tarot readings. I've now become a tarot reader, but that was really one of my interactions with spirituality and finding a spirituality. And of course, if you hang around in New Age bookshops, you come across David Icke at some point. The Robots Rebellion was the first book that was given to me by a friend. And it wasn't until later that he published his theories around the reptilian race in The Biggest Secret. And I do remember reading that, and it went straight over my head. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I couldn't comprehend it, and I sort of breezed through these pages. And so that was around the sort of early, mid-2000s. And then sort of mid to late 2000s, I had my first ayahuasca experience. So I'm going to sort of spend a little time on this story, because actually what happened in this experience for me was that I encountered a reptilian entity. And David Icke tells a story about this, actually, that he was invited to take ayahuasca for the first time because people do report meeting reptilian entities. And so I actually visited, completely kind of by accident, this church here. They're called the Santo Daime. They exist all around the world. They're a fantastic religion that comes out of Brazil, and they use ayahuasca as their sacrament. And they divide the room up into male, female, and they all dress in white. And they essentially take ayahuasca over a period of about 12 hours and sing. It's a fantastically weird experience. And to do that for my first ayahuasca experience was interesting. Because if someone had told me about that, there's no way that I would go and take ayahuasca knowingly in a situation like that. But it is fantastic. The symbol there is representative of they believe in the second coming of Christ, that it's going to come through all people. Essentially, what happened to me in that experience is I was judging this energy as it built up over a period of time. I was looking at what are we doing here? What's this ritual about? What are we doing as human beings? Why are we gathering here? And at that point, I encountered what felt like, it wasn't looked like, it felt like a reptilian entity standing just next to me here on my shoulder. And this reptilian entity started to describe to me how their race had been responsible for creating culture, for creating humanity, and for steering evolution. The feeling that I had at that time was an awful feeling. It was a mixture of shame, guilt, fear, sickness. It was a feeling that I could not describe, actually. It was very difficult to describe, but the best way I could describe it is awful. It was full of awe. And this is actually what happens in sacred experiences. Sometimes we're full of awe, and they are awful as a result. Not that felt particularly sacred, it felt very, very weird. And at that point, we broke for half time for the ceremony. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm going to carry on. And because later on I started to understand a little bit more about what this reptilian idea represented. previously at that point, I had kind of no idea. I returned to my life in London. I stumbled across this amazing graphic novel that shows, Viking warriors and ancient priests standing in stone circles fighting these like huge reptilians. And I realised at that point that this is an old story that we've had for a long time. It's always been going on. And we don't have to look too far for it to find it as part of the human condition and reflected through art history. At this particular point in my life, as Hunter S. Thompson says, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. So I decided to seek some formal education. I studied with Leo Rutherford. I don't know if anyone knows Leo. Does anyone know Leo? Yeah, he's a great guy. I studied with Leo. I did 2 of his courses. I started to go on peyote pilgrimages to central Mexico as well. So I trained with the indigenous Wiradika there in central Mexico that still used peyote as a sacrament. And then I did the Myth, Cosmology and The Sacred MA. It's Angela Voss that runs that degree. And she really ran it as this idea that education could be initiatory. Because I felt that my life up until that point was always this need and this seeking for initiation. I was at a loss for a narrative. I was at a loss for a story. Like, how do I ground my life and my experience in this current culture? I learnt about the word the root of the word education is educare, to lead out. There's some wonderful scholars who I'm going to quote through this talk: Jeffrey Krippel, Bernardo Kastrup, Ian McGilchrist, all in an academic sense start to look at some of the very weird things that can happen in life, around religious experience, around stories and narratives, and around metaphors that we use to describe them. So very, very briefly, these are some of the terms. That myth is sacred story that founds or grounds a particular religious world. Metaphor, it acts like a bridge, really. Metaphor acts like a bridge to like another meaning. It's a classical figure of speech used in poetry, which links 2 things for the sake of describing one through the other. And symbol, similarly, is like a bridge. It's an image, often spontaneous and enigmatic in nature, that shares in the essence of that which it signifies. So it's not what it says it is, it's pointing to something beyond. Both metaphor and symbol do that. And I learned about the word imaginal, the content of our empowered imagination and religious imagination allows us to understand some of the weird experiences that we might have, and that might be extrasensory, that might be ghosts, that might be other entities or synchronicities, and even possibly encounters with reptilians. This idea of transcendence, that there is a state that human beings can access that is beyond all of this, and that is where the real God lies, according to Gnostic teachings. And the importance of initiation. We're hugely lacking that in society, and I personally went on a self-initiating mission in a culture that doesn't have initiatory acts or rituals in order to sort of find myself. And initiation is a set of formalized activities through which a person's social or religious identity is transformed. So really what happened in our culture, as Karl Popper put, is that the conspiracy theory of society comes from abandoning God and then asking what is in its place. Because for hundreds of years we had religious stories, we had God, we had priests, we had the churches telling us this is how life is, and these are the stories that you can use to understand it. During the Enlightenment, we threw out religion, rightly so, and the power of religion at that time needed to be changed. But we kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater. We threw out a lot of mythology and beautiful symbolism as well. So this is the big story, the reptilian problem. And as David Icke said in The Biggest Secret, I wish I didn't have to introduce the following information because it complicates the story and opens me up to mass ridicule, but stuff it. And I love that about David Icke. He doesn't care. And as a human, I think, like, wow, he's gone through a lot, and he's put up with a lot, and he's actually very brave, and I think he's a brilliant character. But look at the language as well that he says, because it complicates the story. David understands that he also tells a story, and he needs narrative in order to get his point across, because what he's talking about is almost beyond understanding. He needs story in order for us to get there. So what is the reptilian hypothesis? I think Andy said it really well. The idea of the Illuminati, that the secret rulers of the world, the secret rulers of the world, the Illuminati, are in fact a race of extraterrestrial reptilians who assume a human appearance. they exist in a parallel universe, similar to how I experienced this reptilian apparition in ayahuasca. Although originally from distant stars, apparently, they also became extra-dimensional. That they feed on fear and anxiety, and it was certainly present in my experience of this thing. It was, I had fear and anxiety at that particular moment in time. It's said that these entities feed on fear and anxiety. They're into ritual, and obviously one of the controversial narratives involved in this is that they're also into ritual abuse, during which time that they shape-shift into their true form, usually through their human host. It was earlier said that they also inhabited underground tunnels and underground worlds. They also have a need, and they have a lot of technologically advanced. They're interested in gold. They're interested in farming gold and taking it off planet. And they're also responsible for the origins of culture, religion, and in fact, humanity itself, and specifically power and control bloodlines that have existed throughout history. So that's the hypothesis. It's heavy stuff, right? It's big stuff, and it's big narratives to deal with. This is my generation. I grew up, walking into the New Age and finding this stuff and going like, wow, look, we're really trying to wrap our heads around what this means. And there is a little bit of scholarly investigation into this stuff. So David Robertson's written, Icke portrays the reptilians as being the phenomenon at the root of folk tales concerning fairies, angels, and other supernatural beings. However, Icke's description of the reptilians are unambiguously demonic, mirroring traditional religious descriptions of demonic figures in numerous respects. Most obviously, their resemblance to snakes seems drawn from Christian imagery relating to the Genesis serpent, who from the Middle Ages has been equated with Satan himself, and who is frequently portrayed with reptilian features. What's more, Icke portrays them as living in subterranean cities and tunnels. Hell, being located underground, is widespread in Judeo-Christian mythology. There's a number of ways that we can interpret this, the features of this reptilian hypothesis, as I had up on the previous screen. So what's good about it? What's good about this reptilian narrative that we have? There is some good about it. I think actually what it is doing is providing a modern day myth and map to people and a culture that doesn't have it. So he's attempting, sorry, that's placeholder stuff underneath, ignore that. But the modern day myth that it's presenting to us, it does actually provide a map and gives us a way in which we can sort of move around reality and understand our place in reality. It also offers an important critique of power and control. Right? He looks at various systems of power in our society and control in our society and begins to sort of hold them to account in a kind of messed up way, I think, but also, at least we're doing that in this model. It does also provide a re-enchantment that somehow, that when you come across this stuff, you start to think, wow, reality is actually kind of weird and amazing, potentially. So re-enchantment is really important. It's also a kind of right brain rebellion that post-Enlightenment, the left brain dominated our culture, the way in which we focus on things, the way we became materialist, scientific. That our right brain essentially got squeezed, and it feels like this is an example of us reaching out for more beyond that cultural paradigm. Icke talks about it a lot. He talks about connecting the dots. That's a right brain activity. Seeing the bigger picture, seeing the bigger narrative at work is part of what our right brain does, and it's antithesis to what science does. And it starts to engage the problem of evil. He begins to tackle like what is the presence of evil, what is it doing here, and what are we to do about it. But also, again, I don't think in a particularly healthy way, but his work and this image also represents a re-emergent Gnosticism. The Gnostics were a rebellious sect that rebelled against the religion of their time and sought God in themselves. And I feel like that's also present in the New Age. I feel like this is still being talked about in some of this work here. I'll touch on a couple of these points in detail. Modern day myth making. Right? Jeffrey Krippau says that mythically ways of thinking have been generally constructed as simplistic, childish, or confused, as a mode of thought that eventually needs to be abandoned for the clean lines and straight thinking of pure reason, logic, and now, of course, modern science. But Bernardo Kastrup says our myth-making capacity may be our key role in the dance of existence. And what about re-enchantment? Kastrup has more to say about this. A religious myth infuses ordinary aspects of life with enchantment and significance. Accidents and coincidences become invested with hidden purposes. Our actions in the world acquire the importance of a cosmic mission. Our suffering becomes the carrier of critical insights. Even objects and people around us acquire a numinous aura. These narratives are responsible for enlightening and awakening the world, really, sometimes, if we get the right narrative. And a re-emergent Gnosticism, as I've said, it's a fantastic book by April D. DeConnick. She talks about the Gnostic New Age. I like to compare the first Gnostics to contemporary New Agers, people who were dissatisfied enough with the spiritual orientations of the conventional organized religions that they went seeking their own answers beyond the borders of traditional dogma. And Icke himself is actually quite Gnostic. There's nothing more Gnostic than what he says here, really, and this is post his ayahuasca experience. All that exists is one infinite consciousness, which was referred to as the infinite, oneness, and the one. In our manipulated illusory reality, we had become detached from the one, in our minds, though not in fact. And therefore we viewed everything in terms of division and duality, instead of seeing that all is connected, is the same infinite oneness. Now this is pure Neoplatonism. These ideas have been around for a long time. They stretch back into ancient Greece and even ancient Egypt. You know, this talk of the one, the talk of being trapped in the sense world. What happened in the Neoplatonic tradition is that you were able to work your way back up to the one. What we have at the moment now is that we're stuck in the sense world with some of these. This is some of the problems around the narrative that we've inherited here. I'm going to skip that one. Do you want me to go back? There's a little yelp there when I did that. I will go back. So the goal of Gnostic religions and movements is to alleviate human suffering and isolation by addressing our ultimate concerns, deepest yearnings, and profoundest experiences through myth and ritual. They were about the renewal of human as God and wielding of this personal power to forge a better life in here and now. So what's bad about this reptilian myth and story that we've inherited? I would say that there's a bit of narrative confusion about it. Again, sorry about those placeholders underneath. There's a significant narrative confusion that occurs with what David Icke talks about. He confuses sometimes the Matrix film, for example, or They Live, as examples of what is really going on. But of course, they're narratives. So there's an issue here about telling stories. And I think that David understands that he needs story to tell his point. But there becomes an issue here in this confusion between sort of what's true and what's fiction. And that's also a hangover from the Enlightenment. The problem of evil hasn't quite been solved with this either. You know, it becomes personified. It brings evil closer to us. It puts it in our institutions and in our our governments and in the heads of big corporations, right? So it doesn't quite solve it still. It sort of brings it closer to us, it feels. As a result of some of these interpretations, it feels like we're trapped in literalism, like these things are literally true. We're stuck with them. We're stuck with the idea that there is interdimensional reptiles in positions of power, and they are here. It's a very literal way of saying and interpreting the idea. There's obviously no shadow integration here either. Like shadow integration is a very important part of psychotherapy. It's what you project out into the world is also an image of something that you contain in yourself, and it's very important that you work on yourself, work on the shadowy, hidden aspects of yourself in order to function in the world more effectively. And actually, I also think there is a narrative of powerlessness. This idea that there's these very powerful interdimensional entities are here in our institutions and in our corporations that are part of our daily life. I feel like that narrative gives them a lot of power, right? If anything, the powerful people in the world will cement their position of power if we keep saying that they're this supernatural force. So narrative confusion, as I've said, the V series. I know, has anyone seen that? Is anyone aware of this TV series where, these beings arrive and they're hiding under human form and they pull off their masks and they're the reptilian underneath? You know, David uses this a lot. And David Robertson says, its writers intended it to be an allegory of fascism, and multiple aspects of the plot and design are obvious references to the Nazis, from the costumes, the human characters being split into collaborators and resistance, and even a character who is a Holocaust survivor. Again, as I said, Icke's work is not often taken seriously by scholars or by the popular media. To a large degree, this must be due to the apparently outlandish nature of his claims, which I don't agree with. I don't think it's outlandish. I think there's something here. But furthermore, Icke's evidence is frequently drawn from non-scientific sources, channeled documents, and popular films. I don't have a problem so much with the other stuff, but I think popular films is a bit of a problem if you're using them as evidence, which are interpreted as coded fact. Trapped in literalism, what do I mean by that? Jeffrey Kripal says it would be a serious mistake to take the symbol literally, but it would also be a serious mistake to take it as pure fancy, as imaginary. This idea that we don't have to say it's real or not real. We don't have to get stuck in that dichotomy. It can be both. Because if it is a myth, and if it is a story, and if it is an image that we've inherited, it can be both. And that's the power of looking at it in a mythic, symbolic sense. No shadow integration. This is really important. So in the introduction to Carl Jung's thoughts on evil, Murray Steen writes, integration is a term that refers to the psychological act of ownership. That is myself. With respect to integration of the shadow and of evil that it contains, this means that the evil of which I was formerly unaware in myself and probably found in someone else, a projection carrier, I now can locate within. Moral awareness is brought to bear upon an area of attitude, thought or behaviour that had before lain in darkness. It's this idea that if we're going to project this dark, nefarious power onto our rulers, I think we should also look at it in ourselves, and I think also Jung does talk about that in his approach to dealing with the problem of evil. Jung was around during the time that the Nazis were at the height of their power. Murray Steen says a careful examination of conscience and of personal unconscious is therefore the first requirement if one seeks seriously to do something about the problem of evil. I completely agree. So a narrative of powerlessness, right, that I touched upon, it feels like we're giving our power away to these people if we say that they're controlled by interdimensional lizards and that they can't, there's not much, it doesn't feel like there's much we can do about that. Murray Steen says it as well, like the ideologue depends on drawing archetypal projections to himself from the populace, which in turn robs the populace of its authority and certainly robs individuals of an integrity as ethical human beings. I think that's a really important idea to grasp here. Once the work of shadow awareness and integration has been to a large extent done by the individual, the work of confronting evil and dealing with it continues, but in the wider society and politics. So the suggestion here is that we need to work on this stuff, some of these issues that Icke is, I feel, projecting into the world on our behalf, within this cosmology and within this narrative, that we actually need to also work on these things in ourselves. So the ugly side to this narrative is that he's been critiqued for being racist, right? That some people say that the term reptile is synonymous with Jew. I don't agree with that. I think he's talking about the human condition. But there is a problem with significant othering that's going on here. He does project onto other people, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know, name some people, the Queen, there she is. Yeah, so there's a significant othering that's going on here, and that's a problem because of what it leads to. It can lead to fundamentalism and extremism. So with this, significant othering, what is important to recognise is that these accusations form a common pool of images from which descriptions of otherness, someone else other than you, from which descriptions of otherness may be drawn. The same accusations were made against those purportedly influenced by the devil in the medieval witch crazes, and pertinently against the Jews in Europe from the medieval period until the present day. Obviously, with the reptilian agenda, there's this link with the ETs, right? That the extraterrestrials are also sort of working in cahoots with them. And Robertson says, by placing ultimate responsibility for the rapaciousness and iniquity of contemporary society with malevolent ETs, we effectively remove the responsibility from humanity, for the other is constructed as literally alien. And this problem of fundamentalism and extremism, as Nietzsche says, he who fights against monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster in the process. And we recently had this very sad story of a guy who killed his children because he believed that his wife had passed them serpent DNA. And back to Carl Jung, we need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all evil coming. That sounds really pessimistic, right? But I think what he's saying is that we haven't developed ourselves. There will inevitably be pockets and moments that we will describe as evil because we haven't worked on ourselves. So what about how can we reinterpret this story? As Ian McGilchrist says, the only certainty, it seems to me, is that those who believe they are certainly right are certainly wrong. And David does strike me as someone that wholeheartedly believes in what he's saying. And I don't blame him, because he's had so much mud slung at him that I think his walls have come up. And he doesn't listen to criticism and debate, I don't believe. I'd love to see him debate someone, but he doesn't feel like someone who's exposed to a different perception of his ideas. And that can sometimes and often make people wrong. I'm not saying David's wrong. I think it's very interesting. So if we are to interpret the reptilian hypothesis, idea, as a myth, we start to look at it slightly differently. From the inside, a major myth expresses how the world works and what a people's place in this world should be. So it's important that our myths enable us to be present in the world and not scared, for example. The internet is cruel, right? Someone made a reptilian image of David Icke. And what I want to say is that this particular passage is a bit long, but really it's this idea that symbols, and I want to say that this, as I said to you before, I feel like my generation, we inherited this symbol of the reptilian, right, in positions of power, hidden, that actually we don't have to take it as it is, that actually we can reinterpret it differently and we can actually add to it and change it. And that's also the power of looking at story like that. So a symbol is a sign that appears spontaneously in the psyche of an inspired poet, prophet, dreamer, or visionary. Is David Icke a visionary? He quite possibly is. And is understood to somehow share in the essence or nature of that which it signifies. Once such psychic events are expressed in language and elaborated in art, as David has done in his books, doctrine, myth, or ritual, they no longer need to be spontaneously produced. They are now part of the cultural currency. They've gone public. And David brought them public, in fact. Accordingly, they can now take on different meanings, even entirely new or opposite meanings, as future generations encounter, appropriate, and trade them within a shared social environment. So is the reptilian a contemporary monster? Because we've had monsters appear before in our narratives. Vered Wise, in this brilliant book, Demonic Imagination, wrote that the monster is found in every known nation. All cultures have some variation of a creature that embodies fears and outlines the borders and boundaries of what is considered sociably acceptable. Krippau says they are dramatic expressions of the liminal, this place in between things, that they combine things that should not be combined, reptilian, human. Hence the zombies, the living dead, or the werewolf, at once half human or half wolf, or the Frankenstein monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, at once scientific and supernatural. It was actually made of body parts. It talked about what the Enlightenment said, which was that we are the sum of just parts. We are a machine. That created a monster. They throw together things that should not be thrown together. They are also profoundly impure. There's a profoundly impure aspect to this monster that we've inherited today. And there's some lessons from the UFO phenomenon as well. As James Gallant said in The Humiliating UFO, the lessons of the UFO may be that those content with the little isle of intelligibility on which the sciences have marooned us will be reminded forcibly of the sea of their unknowing. This is to say that these phenomena exist in human minds and human experience, and science does not know what to do with it. And there's a reason for that, because science isn't the only way to know things, right? And when it comes to UFOs as well, the Native American Indians had a different way of looking at them and engaging with them. Looking into that mirror, Euro-Americans, the UFO mirror, Euro-Americans should not be tricked by what they often see, some Cold War anxiety or technological fantasy. Very similar encounters can be found, after all, in modern Native American culture, where they are generally, but not always, experienced very positively and quite consciously. As a matter of fact, encounters with ancient ancestors, often called star people, observers or keepers, and function as the numinous source of religious belief and community feeling. There's a little Cold War paranoia here. So this is a literary tool, a biblical tool. What about if we applied it to the reptilian myth? It's called the four sense hermeneutics, and it's displayed well here with this idea of the heart. So we have a literal heart. We have this sort of image of a heart that we know represents love and the moral side of heart. We have the allegorical side, which is encouraging us to act, Richard the lion heart. And then we have the sacred heart, which is the highest spiritual essence of the image of the heart. That if you remain stuck in the literal interpretation of heart, then you cut yourself off from all these other meanings and potentially cut yourself off from a much more spiritual process as well. I'm putting it out there. I don't know if there is a way that we can apply this to the reptilian myth, quite possibly. Ian McGilchrist talked about a brilliant, and Andy mentions him in his book, quite rightly so, that the divided brain metaphor is very, very useful to understand what the split in our society at the moment. Essentially, he says that our brain is divided in two, not literally. In some ways it literally is, but in so many other ways it's metaphorical. And it explains a lot about the division that we experience in society and have done throughout history. So I want to suggest this idea. This is the idea that came to me during the ayahuasca experience. So I want to go back to that story now. That when we broke for half time and I'd encountered a reptilian entity, I felt like if I take any more of that shit, ayahuasca, I was going to die. And that was a clear feeling that I had. And I thought I just couldn't possibly force any more of that down my throat. And as soon as we walked in, we queued up again and we had our fourth glass. At which point I started to stagger about a bit, and the whole place is kind of dancing like this, and everyone's kept in a very specific place, and I was just missing the beat and moving all over the place. And so eventually I left and went outside and vomited, purged. Someone came and said, this is all part of it, this is normal, it's all good. Go and lay down. They led me to a bed. They had beds on the side for people that were like in these heightened states. And I lay down in bed and I could see all these kind of crazy images and laser beams and stuff. And at this point, I just said to myself, do you know what? I feel so bad, I'm just going to die. Just die, it's easier. And so I just allowed myself to die. And that was actually the beginning of a wonderful experience. It could be called ego death or something like this, but it was the psychedelic initiation brought me to that point. And at that point, I began to hear the music a little bit differently. It sounded beautiful, and I went back into the space, and this was the moment of what the Santo Daime called the mirasao, the miraculous moment where you can have revelations. And I started to think about, and this reptilian entity had completely gone. It wasn't part of my picture. It wasn't, the feeling that I had at that time wasn't there. It wasn't around. And what I started to understand, and maybe, was that maybe there's something about us that's reptilian. Our brain is reptilian, right? There's a part of our brain that is reptilian. And David does talk about this. The reptilian brain functions on fear and survival, right? And we come from reptilians, evolutionary speaking, if you believe in that model. the argument is that we came from some sort of reptilian source. It's a common ancestor and therefore forms a part of our reptilian brain. And we needed that in order to survive, for humanity to get to where we are. So it's kind of like, okay, we've survived enough. What about if we move out of that part of our brain? What if we stop being trapped in fear and the fear of survival? And this was the sort of feeling that I started to get. And then I sort of judged and looked at our culture, how our culture operates, you know, fear of survival, repetition, more fear, pumped into the news media every day. It's just like, this is triggering our reptilian part of our brain, right? And there's two ways of looking at that. You could say that it's done on purpose because the media are owned by the people that in power. But what's to say that it's not just part of an evolution of humanity, that we just evolve in? We need to evolve more out of that part of our brain into a higher, different realm, beyond the fear of death. And what I realise is that the fear of death is what actually keeps you trapped in that part of the brain. So this was an idea that I thought I would express, that also if you accept my idea or my suggestion that we live in a partially reptilian held or gripped culture, that people that rise to the top in that culture would naturally be operating a little bit more from that reptilian brain. Seems to make sense to me a little bit, in the presence of the queen who rose to the top and her family rose to the top and that whole story. But yeah, I found that this idea of seeing it metaphorically felt like an interesting way to interpret the myth. And up until that point, I didn't know how to interpret it. It was literally just in David Icke books. Then I met this apparition, and then I sort of arrived at this idea, which I'm sharing with you. That recently there was a brain scan, a live brain scan, an EEG brain scan of someone who's, I think they've been tested for something else, and they started to actually die in the EEG. So there's a brain scan of like the first ever recorded brain scan of what happens to the brain when someone dies. And they found that it went straight into like memories of the past and beautiful, images. So it literally moved out of this other part of the brain. There's no fear of death, no fear of survival. It moved into memory recall, and it's similar to dreaming and meditation. So that felt like a concept to me that kind of backs up what I was saying before, that initiation, because all initiation rites across the world have at their core a confrontation with death. And my argument would be is that confrontation with death is actually what loosens the grip of the reptilian part of our brain. So what about rewriting this story, this reptilian hypothesis that we've inherited? Philip K. Dick, a sci-fi writer, wrote, "Today we live in a society in which spurious realities are manufactured by the media, by governments, by big corporations, by religious groups, political groups. So I ask in my writing, what is real? Because unceasingly we are bombarded with pseudo-realities manufactured by very sophisticated electronic mechanisms. I do not distrust their motives, I distrust their power. They have a lot of it, and it is an astonishing power, that of creating whole universes, universes of the mind. I ought to know, I do the same thing." So he's acknowledging the power of writing, the power of storytelling. It frames our reality, and it's happening constantly in our news media. Bernardo Kastrup says, "Partake in reality as an actor in a theatrical play, with attention, dedication, and an open heart, but never believe yourself to be your character, for characters spend their lives chasing their own shadows, whereas actors embody the meaning of existence." And my favourite, I think Robert Anton Wilson is a prophet of this particular time, said, "You should view the world as a conspiracy run by a closely knit group of nearly omnipotent people, and think of those people as yourself and your friends." So what about this idea of narrative transformation through self-initiation? Robert Anton Wilson did this in his book. Has anyone read The Cosmic Trigger? Yeah, fantastic book. It's like live reporting from one of the weirdest times in modern history, and he really went in. He began receiving transmissions, messages from Sirius. And as a result, had some very, very weird encounters. and this quote says, the extraterrestrial explanation was not the real explanation, as it turns out, as I had thought. It was just the latest model for the experience, as angels had been a model for it in the Middle Ages, or dead relatives speaking through mediums had been a model in the 19th century. So he started to realize that the narrative model which he was using dictated his reality. He talks about reality tunnels, that we choose our reality and then we walk down it. If you want to be, there's a famous quote where he says, if you want to be a Republican, you walk down the Republican reality tunnel, and reality has this funny way of feeding back and confirming your beliefs, right? But by the time that he re-released The Cosmic Trigger, he wrote in the introduction, I no longer believe anything in capitals, because he believed that belief in something is the antithesis to like intelligence. He didn't want to lock himself into any particular belief. So this is what I'm bringing really, is that if we choose to believe the reptilian hypothesis, myth, then perhaps we're locking ourselves into it, and perhaps we're making it more real for ourselves. But maybe there's another way of interpreting it. It's here. I don't think we should deny the images, which is what the vast majority of people are doing with David Icke. Just saying, he's mad, he's crazy, go away. But this story is still here. Just to confuse things, in context with the last quote, Ibn Arabi, Arabic mystic, said, be then within yourself a receptacle for the forms of all beliefs, for God is too vast and too great to be confined to one belief to the exclusion of another. For indeed, he says, wherever ye turn, there is the face of God. They're sort of talking about the same thing. Robert Anton Wilson said, I don't believe anything. And this guy's saying, believe everything. But just as long as you don't get stuck on one belief. So my conclusion, as Murray Steen said in the introduction to Jung's book on evil, the evolution of reality depends upon the dynamic interplay of forces that we call good and evil, and where the evolution of consciousness and spirit is finally heading is still beyond our knowledge. So it feels like we have a part to play in that big cosmic drama, right? That we can divide the world into good versus evil, but maybe it's not happening outside, maybe it's happening inside, and maybe we have a role in this particular cosmic drama. And I found this quote, and I put words in front of it because I thought it was an interesting idea, and I put the word perhaps. But globalization of society does not lead to the death of God, but to the death of the devil. And then I put the shadow, which is our shadow. That maybe when you run out of the other, when the planet becomes unified, there is no other anymore, and that all that's left is the devil within. I thought it was an interesting quote. I think there's problems with globalization, as probably many people in this room do as well, but I thought that was interesting. So in conclusion, some key ideas to contemplate. We need to take creative ownership of our myths. It's very important that the stories that we live through us as well. We live in them, and they live through us. It's very important that we take creative ownership of these myths. And also the symbols, exactly the same. The symbols that we inherit in our society, the symbols that we use, the symbols that we say are used only by people in power. Let's take them back and use them differently. Let's subvert the story. And I want you to also remember that we live in our stories, right? And that our stories live us. So, as Robert Anton Wilson said, in conclusion, there is no conclusion really. Things will go on as they have, getting weirder all the time. Thank you.